Welcome to the debate. On May 31st, 2026, the quiet, tight-knit community of Sandy, Oregon lost its illusion of safety when a domestic disturbance call erupted into a barrage of gunfire. What followed was a terrifying 4-hour standoff involving hostages, human shields, the tragic deaths of 3 individuals, and the severe wounding of an 11-year police veteran.
Yeah, we often think of suburban and rural borders as these, protective barriers against the kind of explosive mass casualty violence we usually associate with larger cities. But as the shattering of glass and, frankly, the wail of sirens on Evans Street demonstrated, geography it offers absolutely no immunity.
It really doesn't. Before we begin, please take a moment to like, subscribe, follow, and turn on notifications for our show.
Yes, please do.
As a quick update, we continue to monitor the Martin Stevens versus OpenAI matter. It is important to note that this is still not a lawsuit. We remain in a voluntary quiet period at the request of Martin Stevens to allow time for any potential developments behind the scenes. At the time of this recording, we do not know whether any progress has been made. No settlement discussions or negotiations have been publicly confirmed. We can also report that the dead man switch has not been activated, meaning Martin Stevens remains safe from both a physical and legal standpoint. We will provide updates if circumstances change.
Right.
Now, let us turn to the harrowing events that unfolded on Evans Street. Today, we are analyzing the devastating incident in Sandy, Oregon, involving 38-year-old suspect Brian Andrew Moore, who faces multiple profound charges, including 3 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping for the use of human shields.
Yeah, we're going to be examining the massive multi-agency law enforcement response that eventually ended the standoff peacefully.
Exactly. So the question before us today is this: does the ultimate peaceful surrender of the heavily armed suspect demonstrate the triumph and necessity of modern tactical law enforcement protocols in containing unpredictable violence, or
does the staggering loss of life prior to containment expose the inherent systemic limitations of reactive policing when handling explosive domestic violence incidents?
Right. I will be arguing that the rapid, overwhelming multi-agency response and disciplined tactical containment successfully neutralized a mass casualty threat, which I believe proves the efficacy of modern crisis resolution even in small-town settings.
And I will be arguing that by the time tactical containment is achieved, the most catastrophic damage is often already done, revealing the severe limitations of treating escalating domestic violence purely through the lens of a reactive tactical response.
Okay, so to begin this analysis, we really have to ground ourselves in the logistical and tactical realities of what actually happened on the ground. The law enforcement response in Sandy, while undeniably tragic in its human cost, I'm not minimizing that, represents a highly effective textbook execution of tactical containment.
But we have to be incredibly careful with the word effective here. I mean, effective carries a lot of weight.
Well, let me unpack exactly what I mean by effective, because we are talking about domestic violence calls, which are statistically and historically the most unpredictable, dangerous situations law enforcement officers walk into.
Absolutely.
Shortly before 4 p.m., officers arrived at the 3950 block of Evans Street. They were not arriving to an active shooter scenario. They were responding to a disturbance, but the moment they made contact, the suspect immediately opened fire. Officer Garrett Thornton, an 11-year veteran, was severely wounded, shot multiple times, and ultimately required a life flight helicopter evacuation.
Right, it was an immediate escalation.
Exactly. In a fraction of a second, this ceased being a standard disturbance call and instantly transformed into a dynamic mass casualty event. The suspect, Brian Andrew Moore, the felon who legally should not have possessed a firearm in the first place, immediately escalated to lethal force.
Mm-hmm.
What makes this response a triumph of modern policing is what happened next. The responding officers pinned him down. They triggered a massive mutual aid response. We saw the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office, the East County Metro SWAT, the Oregon State Police, and various local units mobilized perfectly.
They did mobilize quickly, yes.
And despite the suspect utilizing innocent people as human shields, The police maintained discipline for 4 hours, resulting in a peaceful surrender at 8 p.m., without further loss of life or harm to the surrounding neighbors.
Okay, but you are entirely framing this from the moment the police machinery begins working as intended. And by doing so, you're overlooking the profound systemic failure that preceded it.
How so?
The deaths of Jenna Mary Overson, Mary Beth Overson, and Coben McClure underscore a really grim reality. Tactical perimeters and armored vehicles are inherently reactive tools. They are responding to a failure.
Well, yes. Policing is often reactive by nature.
Right, but we are talking about a 4-hour neighborhood lockdown where terrified residents were literally pushing couches against their front doors. We are talking about a triple homicide. To frame this as a contained situation is a severe miscalibration of success, I think.
I wouldn't call it a miscalibration.
It highlights the terrifying vulnerability of small communities to explosive domestic violence, where the fatal damage occurs in the blind spot before the tactical apparatus can fully assemble. I mean, the damage was done.
I completely understand the horror of those 3 lost lives. I really do. But to understand the absolute necessity of the tactical response, we have to look closely at the mechanics of that initial contact. I want to zero in on what happens just before 4:00 p.m. An officer approaches a residence. In tactical terms, they are stepping into what is known as the fatal funnel.
For our listeners who aren't steeped in law enforcement doctrine, could you break down exactly why that architectural space is so uniquely deadly? Because it's a fascinating concept.
Absolutely. The fatal funnel is essentially any doorway, hallway, or narrow threshold. From a geometric and lighting standpoint, the officer approaching the door is silhouetted against the outside light. They have absolutely zero cover.
Right, they're entirely exposed.
Entirely exposed. The person inside the residence, however, is concealed by the interior shadows and the structure of the building itself. The person inside holds every physical advantage. When Officer Thornton and the responding units arrived, they stepped into that funnel and were immediately met with a barrage of gunfire.
Yeah, but here is where the training dictates the outcome. They returned fire, they engaged the threat immediately, despite taking casualties.
But this brings us straight to the OODA loop constraint, doesn't it?
You mean observe, orient, decide, act?
Exactly. Military strategist John Boyd's concept. It was originally developed for fighter pilots, but it perfectly applies to a patrol officer stepping onto a porch.
Right. When a police officer walks up to a domestic disturbance, their OODA loop is entirely reset. They are observing the environment, orienting themselves to the noise, deciding how to engage, and then finally acting. But the suspect? The suspect is already at act.
Because he knows what he's going to do.
Yes, the suspect has already decided to shoot. When we look at this situation, the speed at which it escalated shows the suspect held an absolute, overwhelming lethal advantage before the police even put their vehicle in park.
Okay, but that discrepancy in the OODA loop is exactly why the immediate, disciplined return of fire was so critical. By firing back, those initial officers forced the suspect's OODA loop to reset. They pinned him down and trapped him on the second floor of that duplex. Think of those initial responding officers as the primary immune response in the human body. When a deadly, highly aggressive pathogen enters the system, the first white blood cells on the scene take the immediate devastating hit.
Okay, an immune system analogy.
Right. They take the brunt of the damage to engage the pathogen, locking it in place. They essentially flag the infection so the broader system, in this case the SWAT teams and regional mutual aid, can rush in, recognize the exact location of the threat, and isolate it. By taking that hit and returning fire, those local officers prevented Brian Moore from going mobile.
Yeah, but
If he had escaped that duplex, heavily armed, highly agitated, and willing to shoot police, this would have become a wider active shooter scenario tearing through the streets of Sandy.
let's pause right there. I want to pull that immune system analogy apart because I think it reveals the exact flaw in the reactive policing model you're praising.
Go ahead.
Yes, a white blood cell takes the hit to flag the pathogen, but a healthy immune system also produces antibodies to prevent that specific pathogen from ever taking root again. Our societal approach to domestic violence doesn't do that. It just waits for the next infection.
Well, society and biology are a bit different.
Sure, but your analogy relies on the premise that it is acceptable or at least functionally expected for a patrol officer to act as a tripwire to locate a lethal threat. This was a felon in possession of a firearm. The systemic failure isn't in how the officers returned fire. It's the fact that our framework placed a lethal firearm in the hands of an individual with a felony record, virtually guaranteeing that the initial police contact would be outgunned.
This is what we call the ambush paradigm. Domestic violence incidents are the most lethal calls precisely because the abuser is already operating at peak adrenaline, already willing to commit violence, and when armed, dictates the entirety of the engagement. Relying on a patrol officer to take a bullet so the SWAT team can arrive isn't a triumph of tactical response. It's a desperate, bloody backstop to a societal failure.
I don't disagree that society failed to keep a gun out of a felon's hands. That's a given. But law enforcement is the last line of defense. They do not have the luxury of redesigning society's safety nets in real time while bullets are flying.
No, they don't.
They have to manage the explosion. And when we look at the transition from that initial ambush into the standoff phase, we see the absolute peak of modern tactical escalation working to de-escalate violence.
Escalation to de-escalate. Yes, exactly. Following the shootout, the suspect barricaded himself on the second floor of the duplex. We know from the charging documents that he utilized people as human shield hostages. We cannot understate the psychological and tactical nightmare this presents to an incident commander.
Oh, it paralyzes the entire operation.
It severely limits options, yes, because you are in a residential apartment complex. Standard building materials like drywall and plywood offer zero ballistic resistance.
Right, a bullet goes right through.
A stray bullet from a rifle can travel through multiple apartments. If you order a dynamic breach sending a SWAT team kicking through the door, you trigger a chaotic firefight in a confined space where hostages are being used as physical cover.
Which usually ends in tragedy.
Almost always. And this is precisely why the specialized equipment they brought in was so vital. They deployed police robots to maintain visual and auditory contact without risking human life. And crucially, they brought in the Oregon State Police's Rook.
Let's clearly define what the Rook is for the audience, because calling it specialized equipment almost softens the reality of it.
That's fair. It is essentially a heavily armored tactical skid steer. It operates on tracks, it can navigate over debris or uneven terrain, and it is equipped with NIJ Level 4 armor, which stops armor-piercing rifle rounds.
It's a tank for the suburbs.
Effectively, yes, but its true value in a barricade situation is twofold. First, it has an armored deployment platform that can physically elevate officers to a second-story window. Second, it possesses hydraulic breaching tools that can literally tear the front wall off a building if necessary.
Wow.
By deploying the Rook, police neutralize the suspect's high ground advantage. The second-story window is normally a position of supreme tactical dominance for a shooter. The Rook brings impenetrable armor right up to eye level. It allowed police to negotiate from a position of absolute safety and overwhelming physical dominance. It removed the urgency. The incident commanders didn't have to succumb to adrenaline or the urge to rush in and avenge their wounded colleague. They held the perimeter for hours.
I understand the mechanics of the Rook and the tactical doctrine of surrounding a barricaded suspect. I do. But you are abstracting the sheer terror inflicted on the community and the hostages to praise the machinery.
I'm not abstracting it, I'm explaining the solution to it.
Let me offer a different analogy then. Praising the deployment of the Rook and the SWAT perimeter in this context is like praising the fire department for arriving with state-of-the-art hook and ladder trucks only after the house has burned completely to the foundation.
That's a bit extreme.
Is it? Yes, keeping the ashes from blowing into the neighbor's yard is strictly necessary, but it doesn't mean the fire was successfully fought. The use of human shields is what paralyzes the tactical advantage of the police. The police weren't showing restraint just out of discipline. They were paralyzed by the suspect's use of innocent bodies as cover.
But they adapted?
He dictated the terms of that standoff. While the Rook was sitting outside, a neighborhood was locked inside their homes. Witness Jaden Garcia saw the suspect moving through the second-floor window. Another resident reported his daughter was trapped in the middle of the shooting, hiding blindly in her apartment, pushing furniture against the door.
Right, which is awful.
That is a community held hostage. The technological prowess of the Rook outside is entirely meaningless to the victim being held at gunpoint inside.
See, I strongly challenge that premise. The heavy machinery is absolutely not meaningless to the victim inside. It is the specific mechanism that preserves their life.
How so?
Consider the psychology of the barricaded suspect. He is highly agitated, he has just committed murder, and he has shot a police officer. If he looks out the window and sees patrol cars and officers hiding behind engine blocks, he might believe he can fight his way out. He might believe he still possesses agency in the gunfight.
Okay.
But when he looks at the window and sees a heavily armored tracked vehicle lifting a bulletproof shield to his exact elevation, his psychological calculus changes entirely. He sees an impenetrable wall of armor. He realizes he has zero avenue of escape and he cannot outgun the machinery parked on his lawn.
Right.
That visual of overwhelming force is what drives a barricaded shooter toward the decision to surrender rather than execute his hostages and go out in a blaze of glory. Furthermore, let's look at how that force was assembled. Sandy is a small town.
Yes, it is.
Mayor Kathleen Walker rightly stated, "Our small town is not shielded by distance or size." Sandy sadly has joined an unfortunate group of other towns to face this crisis. But what counters that vulnerability is the rapid integration of regional resources. Officers from Wilsonville, Happy Valley, Gresham, and Washington County seamlessly mobilized to assist Sandy PD. This proves that distance does not prevent a robust, unified law enforcement network from projecting overwhelming force to protect a community.
Okay, that mutual aid response looks incredibly impressive on an after-action report, but let's talk about the physics of time and distance, because that is where the rural and suburban myth of safety truly shatters.
Geography is a factor, yes.
A massive factor. Sandy is roughly 30 miles east of Portland. Let's walk through the logistics of mobilizing that response. An officer is shot. The call goes out. A SWAT team in Washington County or Wilsonville has to activate. The operators have to gear up, assemble at a staging area, load the Rook onto a heavy-duty flatbed transport truck, navigate highway traffic even with lights and sirens, arrive at Evans Street, unload the heavy equipment, brief the operators on the tactical situation, and then finally deploy to the target structure.
Right. It's a process.
You cannot outrun physics. That process takes time. It creates a critical, deadly vacuum in the opening hour of the incident. In the time it takes for that regional cavalry to arrive, the local Sandy officers are entirely on their own. They are the ones trying to hold a perimeter with standard patrol rifles against a barricaded suspect holding human shields.
Which they did successfully.
But the trauma inflicted on that tight-knit community, where neighbors were used to an environment where everyone knew each other, happens in that vacuum. Structural mutual aid agreements cannot prevent the terror of that golden hour of violence. The mayor is absolutely right that distance and size do not shield them. In fact, distance and size make them exponentially more vulnerable because the heavy tactical machinery is miles away when the first shots ring out.
I acknowledge the delay inherent in physical distance. It is an unavoidable reality of geography. But that is precisely why the actions of the initial Sandy and Clackamas County officers were so vital. They did not retreat, they held the line and contained the threat to a single duplex until that heavy cavalry could bridge the geographical gap. And this leads directly to the ultimate resolution of the event. At approximately 8 p.m., Brian Andrew Moore surrendered. He walked out of that duplex and was taken into custody peacefully and entirely unharmed. Chief Husky confirmed the arrest and the shelter-in-place order was lifted. Moore now faces profound charges, 3 counts of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and weapons charges.
Yes, he's facing the justice system.
We must pause and recognize the magnitude of this outcome. Taking a heavily armed suspect, a man who has just murdered 3 people and shot a police officer, into custody alive and unharmed is the absolute pinnacle of disciplined policing.
It is disciplined. I'll grant you that.
In decades past, a suspect who shot a police officer was almost guaranteed to die in a hail of return fire. By taking him alive, the police guarantee that Moore will face the justice system. It guarantees that the Clackamas County Major Crimes Team can extract answers, conduct interviews, and provide a procedural legal close to the chaos. The system worked. It captured a mass murderer without compromising its own ethical standards or causing further collateral damage to the surrounding homes.
You are highlighting a deeply painful, almost absurd paradox in modern law enforcement.
How is it absurd?
Can we truly call a resolution successful when 3 innocent people are dead in the building behind the suspect as he walks out in handcuffs? Yes, the police showed incredible restraint in not killing Brian Moore, but a peaceful surrender at 8 p.m. is profoundly cold comfort to the families of Jenna Mary Overson, Mary Beth Overson, and Coben McClure. Their deaths highlight the exact systemic limitation I have been arguing from the beginning. The system works flawlessly to arrest the perpetrator, but it is fundamentally incapable of saving the victims.
But again, you're asking law enforcement to have a time machine.
No, I'm asking for a realistic assessment of what we call success. We pour millions of dollars into SWAT training, armored rooks, and interagency radio networks so that we can perfectly contain the perimeter of a murder scene. We celebrate the procedural victory of capturing the killer alive. But what about the systemic warning signs? Domestic violence of this magnitude does not manifest out of thin air.
No, it usually doesn't.
It escalates. There are behavioral precursors, threats, and illegal firearm possessions by felons. If we only judge the success of our society by how cleanly the police execute a tactical siege, we are implicitly accepting that the mass murder of families inside their own homes is just a cost of doing business. The system did not work. The system comprehensively failed Jenna, Mary Beth, and Coben, and then it arrived with an armored vehicle to arrest the man who killed them.
I hear the deep frustration in your assessment, and I do not dismiss the profound tragedy of those 3 lost lives. I really don't. But I must push back on the idea that because the police cannot preemptively solve the psychological and societal drivers of domestic violence, their tactical success in containing the fallout is somehow invalidated.
It's not invalidated, it's tragically incomplete.
Well, law enforcement cannot predict human behavior with perfect accuracy. When all the upstream societal safety nets fail, the courts, the parole boards, the community interventions, the police are called to manage the explosion. In Sandy, they managed a highly volatile, highly lethal situation with absolute precision. They prevented a mobile active shooter. They secured a densely populated neighborhood. They extracted their wounded colleague, Officer Thornton, who survived, and they utilized overwhelming technological and interagency force not to destroy but to de-escalate a barricaded suspect using human shields, culminating in a bloodless capture of the perpetrator.
Right.
So the reality of the tragedy in Sandy is that it was undeniably horrific, but it was ultimately contained by a highly disciplined, technologically advanced law enforcement response that prevented a catastrophic situation from becoming vastly worse.
And I will summarize my position by returning to the victims. The events on Evans Street lay bare the tragic limitations of reactive, tactical responses. We can marvel at the coordination of the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office, the Sandy Police, and the regional SWAT teams. We can be immensely thankful for the survival of Officer Thornton and the bravery of those first responders who stepped into the fatal funnel.
Yes, absolutely.
But we cannot allow the impressive nature of the tactical machinery to obscure the fundamental failure. No amount of armored vehicles, hydraulic breaching tools, or interagency cooperation can undo the explosive lethality of domestic violence once it is unleashed by an armed felon.
No, it can't.
The incident in Sandy serves as a stark warning. When a neighborhood is forced to hide behind couches, and when 3 innocent people are killed before the perimeter is even set, we have to admit the fatal blind spots in our ability to preempt domestic violence. We cannot arrest our way out of the trauma inflicted on a community, and a peaceful surrender does not wash away the blood of the victims.
I believe we have reached a point of convergence on the fundamental human elements of this tragedy. We both agree that the bravery of Officer Garrett Thornton and the initial first responders is unquestionable. And we both acknowledge the profound grief and permanent scarring of the Sandy community.
Center of gravity here. Our divergence remains entirely on how to interpret the systemic response. You see the machinery of containment as a triumph of modern policing that averted further disaster. I see the necessity of that massive machinery as proof of our failure to address the root lethality of domestic violence before the trigger is ever pulled.
Exactly. And examining these devastating events through multiple lenses is crucial. We do not have this debate to place blame on the brave responders who stood on the line that Sunday afternoon, but rather to understand the absolute limits of our societal safety nets and the terrifying realities of domestic violence.
Right.
As the Clackamas County Major Crimes Team continues its investigation, there will be much more to explore regarding the timeline, the suspect's background, and the systemic warning signs that preceded this tragedy.
Which brings us back to the image we started with, the shattered glass of a second-story duplex window in a quiet Oregon town. It reminds us that whether you are in a bustling metropolis or a tight-knit community of a few thousand, the walls of our homes are fragile, and the diagnostic landscape of how to prevent the violence that breaches them remains incredibly murky.
A sobering thought to leave with our listeners. Please remember to like, subscribe, share, follow, and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.